My name's Walter Jenny. I'm the president of the Historical Society. On behalf of the Society, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. 2 items of business. We have a couple of traditions we're going to invoke. You probably know about both of them. The first one, in the words of President Jedediah Bartlett, when the president enters the room, nobody remains seated. So when the president comes in, we should all pay the respect of standing. And that ties in with the other tradition. Dates back to Shakespearean days. It was a cheer that they used. We cheer, applaud and so on today. But the cheer they used was huzzah. Okay? So we will do 3 huzzahs after we stand.
We got to practice.
Aren't y'all Baptists? So we will do 3 huzzahs. 1, 2, 3.
Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!
My dear Jefferson.
My dear Lafayette, a pleasure indeed. Citizens, if you will, and General the Marquis, you know this well. In our nation, we've dispensed with monarchical ceremony. No monarch has entered in this night. Please be seated to your comfort. A delight indeed, citizens, that we've had the opportunity, the General and I, that is, to take leave of my mountaineering upwards of 250 miles to the northeast from here. The General having arrived this year of 24, as you all would know, even here in the wilderness, 18 and 24. And this is possibly the most unrecorded moment in our nation's history that we should all be together because it is April and the General is supposed not to arrive until August. And so we've had a delightful 2 weeks in the saddle to make our way down the old wilderness road. And I to have the opportunity to explain to the General the extensive history of so many who embarked upon a new life from the European kingdoms to sail that ocean, take the risk to come here. So many, as you know, who disembarked in Philadelphia and then took the great wagon road westward and down through the Shenandoah. And it is with that so many other states have been carved, as we know, through the gap to the west. And so the General intends, and I should not speak on your behalf, sir, but I know during this visit, however long it should take you, you intend to travel down this road and to venture out west, to inspect our new states there, as you will throughout the South. An extensive journey, a great honor to us, but how well we know we, of course, extol a great honor to the General and what France did to provide truly the success of our American Revolution. I hope we never forget, my fellow Americans, that the American Revolution would have never been successful without the aid of France. Absolutely.
You honor me so.
So therefore, I should say no more. I look forward to reflections between us, stories we have held in our friendship for so many years, but more importantly, to hear from you, to hear from the people, the voice of the people. Vox populi, vox Dei, as the ancient Romans said. The voice of the people is the voice of God, and therein nature will speak. So, General, I would prefer if you would allow you to make your own introduction, and I shall take a chair to enjoy and welcome the opportunity to speak accordingly.
You are most kind, Monsieur Jefferson. Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis, good people of the city of Abington, please allow me an introduction. The name is General Lafayette, though I believe that most of you, no doubt, know me far better by my name of the Ancien Régime, of the Old Order, of the Revolution here in America. And that, of course, is Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche-Gilbert de Motier, le Marquis de Lafayette. Would you like to repeat that, monsieur? What a pleasure and honor it is to see all of you on this simply magnificent day, to be reunited with my dear friend, Monsieur Jefferson, here in Abington, as you said, in this unrecorded visit here to this part of Virginia. For as many of you are perhaps aware, I have been invited back to America courtesy of your very own President of these United States, Monsieur James Monroe, to be what he is calling a guest of the nation, to tour all 24 United States. Can you imagine? 24 United States. Do you realize the last time I was here you had but 13? Oh, goodness, at this rate you'll have as many as 50 one day. Could you imagine? Well, dear friends, other than this secretive, clandestine visit here to Charlottesville and then onwards to Abington, I shall be making my official entrance into America in August in New York City. And then it is my intent to travel northwards to Massachusetts Bay to meet with, of course, John Adams. Do you know, it is either you or he that said I had a canine appetite for popularity.
That was Mr. Adams.
Of course it was. I'm still not quite sure what to think of that. But then I shall travel southwards and go on to Philadelphia City, where in fact I shall go to that place where you declared for independence. In fact, I think they should refer to it as Independence Hall. It has a good ring to it, does it? Oh. Then onwards to Baltimore and then to the Federal City. And then I will go onwards into Virginia, where I shall travel and hopefully be there upon the anniversary, the 19th of October, 1781, where we won at Yorktown. And it shall be the 19th of October, 18 and 24, where I shall visit. Monsieur Jefferson was telling me jokes about the future, so now we found ourselves there. But regardless, my friends, then I shall go on to that little hamlet of Williamsburg before I venture to the west once again to your beloved Monticello. It shall be a delight. And then we shall have to go onwards to Montpellier to see with our other dear friend, Monsieur Madison. It shall indeed be a delight. But friends, now that I have returned, 40 years after the fact, and I am so pleased that this nation has indeed prospered, we must never forget how that independence was in fact achieved. For all of those brave soldiers, sailors, and Marines alike who fought and bled upon countless battlefields to achieve American freedom, let us applaud them all! Now, my friends, many of you are perhaps familiar with me, the Marquis de Lafayette, that Frenchman who came to help, but some of you are not so familiar with the story of what brought me here in the first place. For I have told you this on many occasions, my dear friend, but for our guests here this evening, I first heard of the great cause of American freedom back in 1775. I was but a sous-lieutenant, a second lieutenant, newly promoted to the rank of captain, in truth, only because my father-in-law owned the regiment. So it was a bit of a wedding gift. Well, there I had found myself billeted in the eastern part of France, in a city called Metz. And as was commonplace back then, we would often have these grandiose dinner parties with all of the most noble officers in attendance. And there we would typically speak about the various subjects of the day. Perhaps a war that had begun, a war that had concluded, perhaps a new treaty that had been signed, perhaps a new innovation in strategy or in tactics. But on one occasion, we had a very special guest, and this guest was none other than the Duke of Gloucester. Indeed, the same name applied to that route principale in your former city of Williamsburg. And many of you might say, well, who is this Duke of Gloucester? Well, he happens to be the brother to George III, the King of England. But unlike his brother, the King of England, the Duke of Gloucester was rather sympathetic to the American cause. In fact, many were of the opinion that he thought America should be free and independent. So we all listened in on what he had to say. Now, of those officers present there that evening, there was the famous Comte de Broglie. You perhaps remember reading about him from his grand exploits during the 7 Years' War, but there were some who said that he was going to be given command of the Continental Army in the place of General Washington. Now, the Comte de Broglie was a fine officer, to be sure, but I think we are all thankful that General Washington remained in command. Are we not?
Yeah, yeah.
Goes without saying. There was, of course, my beloved friend, le Baron de Kalb, the one man perhaps most responsible for bringing me here to America. I can still recall receiving the dispatch of the news of his death after the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. Most distressful to me, but even more so to the great cause of American freedom, for he was such a fine officer. There was, of course, the Chevalier de Buisson. Madame, the Chevalier de Buisson, I thought I recognized you. Madame, you danced a minuet with the Chevalier at the last of the Queen's birthday parties, did you not? Madame, you are being quite modest. You realize you are still the talk at Versailles. My dear friend, she danced the most magnificent minuet I think I have ever seen dance before. Do you recall the name? Oh, how could you forget? It was called Le Dauphin. Perfectly stepped, not one error. Madame, you must have worked with your dance master for weeks, if not months. Oh, and upon conclusion of this perfect minuet, what did the Queen say to you? C'est magnifique. It is magnificent. And you know very well the Queen never gave compliments to anyone but herself. You know, Madame, if only I could find a few musicians, we could all see an example of that minuet. Would you like that, my friends? Oh, alas, Madame, who are we kidding? We'll never find any musicians awake before 9 p.m. Another time, Madame, but rest assured you are still the talk at Versailles. Well, forgive me, I veered off the course. But what inspired me? What did we speak of? We were speaking of the fighting at Lexington and Concord, of your Grand Congress in Philadelphia, and of the great man himself, that of Washington. So, by the conclusion of that meal, I was so inspired that I told my brother officers that I was ready and willing to draw my sword in defense of American liberty. Many have said, why, Monsieur le Marquis? Why would you want to go and fight and perhaps die in another man's war? For France and England were not at war at that moment. Why would you want to risk yourself in such an endeavor? Well, perhaps you know the answer to that question. For this had been a war like none other in the history of man, had it not? This was a war of great ideas, of the freedom, even the liberation of mankind, a war that had embraced the ideas of the great thinkers of what we often refer to as this enlightened age. Some called it an age of reason, with those philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Locke. And what are they speaking of? Representation in government of an equality of mankind. And so it was with this inspiration that I decided to come to America. Indeed, seems so long ago, my dear friend, but I have never regretted my
And nor have we, and yet, is it true, General the Marquis, that you had just recently been married before you made this decision, or did you make it before you were married?
My dear friend, now you are going to embarrass me in front of all these ladies. Yes,
well, I think
true.
it's very clear to all the ladies right here tonight that you certainly do not forget, do you, by any means?
Well, I shall explain. You are correct, my dear friend. I was married prior to my arrival here in America. In fact, I was married on April the 11th of 1774. You see, I have not forgotten my anniversary. But I was but 16 years of age, and my wife was 14. Originally, our families had thought 14 and 12, respectively, but they thought that was too young. So we waited until 16 and 14. Now, with this marriage, we were blessed with 4 children. Of course, our firstborn, Henriette, our secondborn in 77, Anastasia, our thirdborn in 1779, George Washington Lafayette, and the youngest was named Marie Antoinette in honor of the Queen.
Yes, but then as we became friends so early on, I made a suggestion, as later the Queen would be disposed, that you might name her in honor of?
Virginia. Indeed. So her name, Marie Antoinette Virginie, and you are so correct. After the name Marie Antoinette went out of fashion, we simply refer to her as Virginie or Virginia.
Virginia.
Thanks to you, my dear friend. But this is where I fear I will lose all of you ladies. For though my wife was well aware that I wanted to come to America to take part in this noble crusade, I did not exactly tell her when I was going, nor for how long I was going. And, well, I was gone for 2 years. But no doubt all of you ladies would be equally as supportive of your husbands if they disappeared for 2 years. That's a rhetorical question. But indeed, never has a man had a more devoted and loving and understanding wife than my beloved Adrienne. Well, indeed, my friend, that is what brought me to America. And I would take part in the war. I would become a confidant of General Washington, part of his military family. And we would meet for the first time during that epic campaign of 1781.
1781, citizens, how can we forget it in Virginia? We had been spared somewhat, had we not, from the theater of war, which was predominantly up north, being initiated along the Hudson River, but then ultimately to find itself into Virginia. Unsuspecting, if you will, that last year I was looking forward to serving as governor of our Commonwealth. Only 2 years. You could not succeed yourself, elected only to a one-year term and follow. And so I was looking forward to Monday, the 4th of June, 1781, when finally I could turn the gavel over to my successor, the third elected governor of the Commonwealth. But that would not happen. Before we learned earlier in that spring, it was actually the winter turning into spring, was it not? You were the informant of the British sailing up the James River, led by, anyone recall?
Bravo.
No, General Benedict Arnold. General Benedict Arnold is exactly the individual I was informed was leading the enemy up the James to lay waste to whatever they possibly could. First in the Tidewater, Virginia, thank heaven we had already removed our capital by the vote of the Virginia House of Delegates from Williamsburg, where it had been, as you know, 90 years after it moved itself up from Jamestown. And as I took place there in the governor's palace on my desk to make certain that vote would be fulfilled, I think it went through in December of 79, to move our capital to much better defended ground, that is the heights of Richmond. Remember, Williamsburg was on the highest ground between the James and the York. We knew the enemy could sail up either of those rivers and lay siege upon us there. And so it was decided, yes, we must move now. The spring of 1780, we were gone. I was the last resident of the governor's palace there in Williamsburg. And yet all too soon, that following spring, we were informed of the enemy sailing up the James. And because of that, General, I then ordered a retreat farther into the wilderness of Virginia. I ordered a retreat of our government to Charlottesville. Charlottesville, the depths of the wilderness. The enemy would never discover us there. There was hardly any main road. They were all Indian pathways, particularly that three-chopped road, the three-notch road, a connection, if you will, of Indian pathways between Richmond and the eastern range of the Blue Ridge. The enemy would never find their way out there. Well, we don't need to hear that so immediately, do we not? But not all of them. They became somewhat preoccupied. It was a force of dragoons, I believe. You heard, did you not? You were not there, but...
No, but we knew very well of that Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Bloody Ban, as some of them referred to, from his exploits at the Battle of the Waxhaws, there on the border of North and South Carolina on the 28th of May, 1780, where some Virginians under Colonel Buford were dispatched to try and relieve the siege at Charleston. But they were ambushed by Tarleton and his raiders and put to the sword as a result. So thus he gained that reputation as the butcher.
We knew of it. We felt ourselves snug in Charlottesville. I, of course, able to be at home at Monticello, looking forward to that Monday, June the 4th, in residence in my own home, when we knew who would succeed me, General Thomas Nelson, a signer of our Declaration. We were seated down to breakfast there early that morning when suddenly there came a tap upon the window pane. All of us looked and saw the bloodied physiognomy of a young man standing there, panting, needing entrance into the house. He wanted to speak with us, so we immediately welcomed him in. I recognized him first before anyone else. He was Jack Jewett the Younger, the son of John Jewett, the keeper of the Swan Tavern there in Charlottesville, across from the courthouse. He had another tavern, more successful, out in Cuckoo, 40 miles to the northeast from Louisa there. And there the night before, in his father's tavern in Cuckoo, named Cuckoo, would anyone remember why? I often have wondered what became of that clock. It was a very elegant carved cuckoo clock done by one of the Hessian prisoners of war one of several thousand, if you remember, who were barracked along what is still referred to as Barracks Road there in Charlottesville. And so here, young Jack Jewett, while he had been at his father's tavern, heard a number of British dragoons, or the Greencoats as they called them, discussing the orders of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton to ride westward and seek the capture of as many members of the Virginia House of Delegates they could possibly discover in Charlottesville, but most importantly, to seek the capture of Governor Jefferson. Ride to the top of his mountain, he heard them speaking. And so he quickly jumped a horse and he rode all night long through those thickets. That's why he appeared so scratched and cut. And thank heaven we were warned. We refreshed him there at the table, but he would not stay long. He wanted to ride on to Charlottesville and warn others. It gave us enough time, so I thought, to prepare for an escape. And so I made certain that my family was all sequestered comfortably in a large landau that I had recently had designed and built, and saw them set off southwards with the hope that they would arrive at Poplar Forest, my retreat house down in Bedford County. I would follow, I told them, but first I had to make certain that the government papers, all of the archives of the former colony of Virginia, were safe, sequestered under the floorboards of the house, and accompanied, if you will, with the family plate, the silver, and as many valuable relics of our family that we could provide a protection and safety. I remember that Caesar and Madison Hemmings helped me in that effort. And then I had my horse Caractacus brought about, and I mounted Caractacus to ride off and said that I would be back. I would be back, but I wanted to make certain that our House of Delegates were safe there in Charlottesville, to warn them in kind. I decided first to ride up to the top of Mount Alta, just beyond Monticello, there to the west. I made purchase of that in 1777. I will take you there to its heights when we return. My intention is to build an observatory on the very top of that mountain, so that someday I might have the opportunity to see what man has yet to see through the most advanced of telescopes. There in the first, well, I myself rambled, do I not, in that effort. As I approached the top of the mountain, I decided I would dismount and look back to Monticello. I had brought my spyglass with me. As I knelt down on the ground to look at Monticello, my sword got in the way. You know, General, many have forgotten over all the years that I was commissioned a colonel of Virginia militia. Before the war, I still have the 3 swords that I wore in that commission. So here, the one I was wearing got in the way. I unhooked it, put it on the ground, knelt to look through my glass. I did not see any of those green coats ascending the mountain. I thought, oh, they had probably heard the Jeffersons had escaped. So I jumped back on my horse to ride on to Charlottesville, and within a few paces, I realized I forgot something. My sword. So I rode back, dismounted, went to pick it up, gazed out to the mountain, and there, in that short time, my mountaintop was swarming with green coats. You know, they referred to them as green coats because they wore very short green jackets and very high, bare helmets. What is the utility of that in the wilderness, is what I'd like to know.
Well, being that it was a provisional regiment, that of loyalists to the king, they were raised here in America. And to distinguish them from regulars who wore red, typically, they gave them the green coat. John Graves Simcoe, who commanded the Queen's Rangers, also had green coats, as did elements of the American Legion that was created by Benedict Arnold.
They were Virginians who had enlisted in the force of the enemy. Who knows better their horses? Who knows better the old native pathways throughout the wilderness of Virginia? And there, through my spyglass, I watched them burn my barns, burn my crops, slaughter my livestock. And I waited. I waited. And then I saw Madison Hemmings walk out of that west portico. He stood right there. And I saw one of the green coats ride up. I saw him reach into his satchel and pull out a pistol. And then I saw him dismount, and he walked right up those steps to Madison, and he pointed the pistol at him. I could hardly continue to watch when I saw Madison open his coat like this. And that officer, obviously an officer, I learned later his name was McLeod. Kenneth MacLeod. He brought his pistol down, he turned about, and he went like this, and all of those other dragoons dismounted from their horse, several tethered them together, while they all went into the house past Madison. And I waited about an hour or so. When they took leave, came out that very same door, the west portico, their arms were filled with my wine bottles. All of my wine. They put the wine in their satchels, and they rode off.
Well, was it not the king's birthday?
It was indeed the king's birthday, George III's birthday, June the 4th. In fact, as we were seated to breakfast, we were going to propose a mock toast to King George until Jewett appeared in the window pane. But do you know that, that as later we learned, they did apprehend 7 of the Virginia House delegates. They did capture 7. The majority had escaped. Coincidentally, one who was captured, many have forgotten, he was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates at the time. Anyone know of whom I'm referring to? He was captured, but only for a few moments, because he was able to talk his way out of the capture to assure them that he was not a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Anyone heard this legend, which is based in fact? He came right down this road as well, many times was responsible by order of the Transylvania Company to cut through the gap. Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone, they let him go. He talked his way out of it. So I was able to make my way down to Poplar Forest there, one of the happiest months of my life, and there in domestic felicity. I can never forget it. That's why I honor that month there with a very fine retreat house that I have constructed. You must see it. I must take you by Poplar Forest on our return. But you know, it was some years later, General, when I was in Paris. I was dining at Le Procope, one of the finest restaurants in Paris, along the Rue d'Odium. And the garçon came in to inform me. He knew who I was, Minister Plenipotentiary of our nation at the court of King Louis, to inform me that British Colonel Bannister Tarleton was in the next room. That perhaps I should introduce myself, which I was pleased and proud to do so. And so I went into the other room, and he was most gentlemanly. He got up, he welcomed me with a hand clasp, asked me to be seated, and what do you think was the very first thing I asked him? What? Where's my wine? I didn't have to ask him that. I knew he had never tasted better wine in his entire life. Certainly not in England, I can assure you that. No, I asked him, why did you spare my house? This is little known either. Remember, the British were using smallpox as a method of war during the Revolution. In fact, purposely, they enslaved, tied them up against trees so that any who heard their yelps coming to release them would be inflicted as well. And so it was that as governor of Virginia, having long been familiar with variolation, that is the process of inoculation, I inoculated every single one of those Hessian prisoners of war. And so it was that Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton replied, Mr. Jefferson, we spared your house because of your civil treatment of the Hessian prisoners of war. Even in war, civilized man can be a gentleman. I said, you know, Colonel, in so doing, you spared the entire English history of the former colony of Virginia, including the original minutes of the first English-speaking representative form of government in the New World, because I had under those 4 floorboards the minutes of the first Virginia House of Burgesses, convened in the Church of Jamestown, 1619. I beg your pardon, General, but fact will ever be stranger than fiction, will it not?
Indeed, and I recall after your departure from France in October of 1789, I befriended Colonel Tarleton. He had left England because he was in debt, and so he thought he could have new debts made in the city of Paris. And he had brought with him that magnificent actress upon Drury Lane, Mary Robinson.
Yes.
I recall you had met her once or twice within the city of Paris, did you not? A gifted actress, is she not? Well, neither here nor there, but regardless, We spent some time together on the Fête de la Fédération, which takes place, of course, on the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. On the 14th of July, 1790, I invited Colonel Tarleton to ride with me in the procession. And in the newspapers, it was listed that Lafayette and Colonel Tarleton in his American uniform. They were referring to the green one you had spoken of earlier, and we rode together until his departure at the tumultuous time of the Revolution. So you see, once an enemy, then became a friend. I suppose that is best in life, is it not?
It is ever best in life, absolutely best in life. We learned that from the French, in my opinion, having spent 5 delightful years dans la belle France. If I brought anything back from France beyond the element of their success in architecture, painting, sculpture, cuisine, viticulture, it is their sense of joie de vivre, that savoring of every moment of life. For the very short time we are here, why should we contend with one and the other? Seek amelioration, seek compromise, enjoy one and the other's company. And that is what I have endeavored to do, and indeed, as Colonel Tarleton and I found ourselves at that elegant repast. You know, General, when you left our nation after the victory at Yorktown, an occasion I did not have the opportunity to witness, that October 1781 you referred to earlier, a remarkable day that some have told me about, bearing eyewitness as the British troops were marching on to the surrender field. They were led by their military band. Is it true, they tell me, that their band was playing a British drinking song? Have you heard this?
A world turned upside down.
A world is turned upside down. It is fact. In other words, could this be the beginning of the end of monarchy? Let us hope that that is what we continue to show. Yes, as our declaration resonates around the globe. I know that the conquering French troops were barracked in Williamsburg for good, 6 to 8 months there, I believe.
Upon the conclusion of the siege of Yorktown, General Washington, realizing the war was not yet won, the English still held New York City, they still held Charleston, requested of General Jean-Baptiste Donatien-Vimeux, le Comte de Rochambeau, that he remain in Williamsburg with the bulk of the French army. So they were roughly equidistant between those two cities, so if Washington ordered the attack upon New York, they could simply march their divisions northwards, or if he preferred for them to assault Charleston, then they could march southwards. But as it turns out, by June of 1782, really the war had ended here in North America. England was much more concerned with the possibility of invading England by the French. We French have been talking about that since 1066, and it still has not come to pass. But we like to threaten the English with it. So thus, as a result, French troops were needed elsewhere, so they marched to Boston, they boarded their ships, and they returned back to France.
And you returned to France at about that time?
I returned directly after Yorktown. See, many of you perhaps are unaware that I disobeyed my king when I initially came. He forbade any French officers from coming to America lest they might instigate a war with England and France. And we French had just completed a war against England known as the 7 Years' War. You often refer to it as the French and Indian War. But because I was so enthusiastic about taking part in this great crusade, I disobeyed the king. I left my regiment. I went to the western part of France, and there in the port city of Bordeaux, I purchased a ship fittingly called La Victoire, the Victory, and set sail across the ocean. I would, of course, ingratiate myself with Congress and with Washington, and I would continue for 2 years. After those 2 years, I requested of Washington and Congress that I might return back to France to explain myself to the king. And it was granted, and so thus I went back to France. I tried to see the king at Versailles, but he would not see me. In fact, it was far worse. He confined me to house arrest. But admittedly, it was house arrest at a chateau, so it was not so bad. And it was only for 8 days. But for those 8 days, I thought I had ruined the reputation of the Lafayette family, one that had been covered with honor and glory for 1,000 years. Do you realize, my friend, that one of my ancestors is believed to have fought in the Crusades and brought back the crown of thorns from the Holy Land, placing it in the cathedral at Notre-Dame de Paris? One is believed to have fought alongside Jeanne of Arc for the relief of the city of Orléans during the 100 Years' War. One was a Maréchal de France, the highest rank you could achieve in the French military. And of course, my beloved father had been killed by the English at the Battle of Minden, August the 1st of 1759, during the 7 Years' War. So, of course, I thought Marie, Joseph, Polivroche, Gilbert de Motier, le Marquis de Lafayette, would be the last of the Lafayettes to bring honor and glory to the family name. Those 8 days pass, the king calls for me. I enter a small appartement when all of a sudden the doors fly open. It's the king himself, arms open wide, a smile upon his face, and he embraced me. But he whispered in my ear, saying, "Never disobey me again, Monsieur le Marquis." But why had he forgiven me? Several reasons, I think. One, I'd become part of the inner circle of Washington. I'd become a general officer. I had performed well upon the battlefield. But most importantly was the simple fact that France and America had signed the Treaty of Alliance in February of 1778. So we were now allied in a common cause of American freedom. So to quote an Englishman, all's well that ends well.
Indeed, sir. And I think even better for you because your dear late wife, and my sympathies, condolences, and empathy accordingly. I believe she was of royal blood, was she not? No, why?
Indeed.
Her maiden name related to the Bourbon?
Exactly, the Bourbon family, Dunois being that the family name.
Well, a great deal of influence in your favor, I should say, General, and a great deal of influence for all of us to our great benefit as well. You know, when I was commissioned to represent our nation at the court of the late French King, King Louis, I sailed from Boston. It was the 5th of July, 1784. I had hoped to accompany Mrs. Adams. That was an intention. But she had sailed about a week previous to it. And so I understood later when I finally arrived in France that you had been sailing back to our nation from France. So we were ships that literally must have passed in the night upon the Atlantic at that time. But then when you did return, that was what, 1780, let me see, 86, 87?
85.
85, even before. We met up again. And by that time, I had been provided that elegant Hotel Langeac at the convening of the Rue de Berry and the Champs-Élysées. It was at one of the gates, the entrance gates to the city of Paris, the Grille de Chaillot along the Champs-Élysées. And there began many an elegant soiree and repast in your company and so many others who sat at our table. But I was called back too soon after you returned. I had to leave France. It was that autumn 1789. And packing up 86 crates of furniture, paintings, sculpture, books, plate, even the locks from my doors at the Hotel Langeac. We set out from Cherbourg, but were caught in a storm. So we were stalled and could not leave until, I believe it was on or about the 6th of October, which I learned later was a day that will never be forgotten in the history of France or the royal family, let alone your life. I think they would enjoy to hear this remarkable fact of history.
Indeed. Well, when you think of the revolution in France, it is markedly different from that of the one in America in the sense that you began your revolution with a Declaration of Independence. In France, we did not necessarily want to remove the monarchy. We wanted to alter the monarchy. So it was very much a social revolution. We wanted it to be much more like the Glorious Revolution in England of 1688, in which there was a great deal of change, but little loss of life, but for the betterment of the citizens. So the king, of course, at first did not want to relinquish this power of an absolute monarch, but by October the 6th, they forced his hand, they being the people of Paris, most notably the women of Paris. There were 24 million Frenchmen living in France in 1789, and many of them lived in deplorable conditions. And grain, of course, to produce bread was the staple of the French diet. And there were many, many bad harvests, so many people were starving. And so the women of Paris decided to rise up and march to Versailles, which is roughly 15 miles distant, and there demand of what they called the baker and the baker's wife, the king and the queen, that they feed them. So thousands of women began that march to Versailles. I was made commander of the Garde Nationale de Paris, which is a military force to keep order in a very volatile city of 650,000 people. In fact, this is the uniform that I had worn. It still fits, can you imagine, my friend? Well, regardless, being that I was commander of the National Guard, I wanted to keep order, and I did not want these women and other men who had joined them to storm the palace at Versailles. So I acted as an escort. Upon arrival, violence immediately started. Some of the guards outside the palace at Versailles were beheaded, and their heads were placed upon pikes, if you can imagine. So I quickly inserted my National Guardsmen to stop them. But I thought they were going to storm the palace, so I rode my horse right there into the courtyard. I dismounted, I climbed into the palace itself, I came out to the balcony, and there with the Queen, I kissed her hand. And that symbolically ended all of that. The king then called out that all of his reserves of grain be given to all those present, and there was a bit of a festival atmosphere after that. But following that, we were forced to bring the king and the queen and the royal family back to Paris, never again for them to remain at Versailles. But it was at that moment that we changed from a absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, in which now we would have the king as the chief executive, not unlike your president of these United States, but we had a legislative body that could act for checks and balances against the poor decisions of the king, like your Congress or like the English Parliament, but in France we call it an Assemblée Nationale, or a National Assembly of those elected representatives. So just think, while you were there in the harbor, so much change was taking place in France, and the constitutional monarchy was created. I was hopeful that that was going to last forever, but alas, it would not be. Soon, more radical heads would take hold, and by 1792, the king and queen were arrested for crimes against the state and ultimately sentenced to death. And that is where the revolution began to fall apart.
General, help the people understand. I continue to receive these questions, and frequently. What brought on the reign of terror? Why did they resort to such barbarism? And no one believes me, hardly anyone believes me, unless they were there, that no one foresaw that. That was the last thing that anyone would have thought would take place. In fact, we collaborated together on what became the French Bill of Rights and the Citizen. We thought that would explain, not unlike our Declaration of American Independence, how a constitutional monarchy could peaceably and civilly exist. And, well, the monarchy welcomed that, and the Estates Generals returning there to meet at Versailles, until perhaps when the doors of the Menu Plaisirs, that great banqueting hall, were locked so that the Third Estate could not enter. And then, I think you've all heard, the result was the Third Estate met in a tennis court. And they took an oath, the oath of the tennis court, to preserve, to effect and preserve a constitutional monarchy. Our last repast at the Hotel Langeac, July 4th, 1789, I'll never forget. We looked forward to when we might meet again. And do you remember, seated at the table was a doctor, well esteemed in Paris, who had brought along something that was of small model size, covered in a cloth, and that he would more or less, like the other Dr. Mesmer, mesmerize us at dessert by unveiling what he considered a more humane method of capital punishment. The doctor seated at our table was
Dr. Guillotin.
Dr. Guillotin. Who would have thought?
Well, that's a fascinating point you bring to our friends here this evening, because believe it or not, it was not initially called the guillotine. It was called the Louisette. Doesn't sound very foreboding, does it? I'm going to send you to the Louisette tonight. But because, as you have mentioned, Dr. Guillotin was against capital punishment, and he said if it's going to take place, you must do it much more humanely than the way they had been doing it prior to that. So this device began to bear the name of the man who spoke against it. How very bizarre, is it not? But nonetheless, it would be used to great excess once the Republic would be declared in France, and unfortunately the royal family would be sent to the guillotine. Do you know, I was almost sent to it myself.
We heard.
Some of the heads of the French government at that time, Danton, Marat, Saint-Just and the most famous Robespierre called for me to go to Paris. I was commanding a French field army in the north. When I received that message, of course, it would have been folly for me to return. So I decided to flee from France with my family and my staff. And that is when I fled into the Austrian Netherlands, which many refer to as Belgium today. And there I was thrown in prison. For as you can understand, the Austrians were quite angry at the French, were they not? After all, the last Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was of the Habsburg family, the Austrian family. So thus they wanted to punish the French. And since I was so well known, they decided to refuse my parole. Parole, of course, in French means your word. And if you are an officer and you give your parole, you will not take part in any more hostile actions in that theater of operations. So I tried to give my parole, but they would not accept it. So they imprisoned me for 5 long years in Liège and Mayence, and then ultimately in the fortress city of Olmütz in the heart of Moravia. And my beautiful, adoring wife, Adrienne, when she could not get me released, voluntarily joined me in prison. And tragically, that is where she would contract the malady that ultimately would bring about her death. It was only the success of a young French general named Bonaparte, you remember him, who got me out of the prison.
And that is a whole nother scene, chapter, verse, and book. Perhaps that would equally be the subject of another gathering. But citizens, what a pleasure it has been to be in the company of my friend again and to reflect upon so much that we have lived and borne witness to. But as we promised earlier, let this evening be yours. This is the opportunity that anything you bring here in your mind, we may hear freely and safely and securely. Open and free inquiry, Socratic investigation. In fact, I'd be delighted to hear any further suggestions for the pursuit of science. I know that you are a gentleman devoted to scientific investigation. Any interest upon our love of education, and that it ought to be the birthright of every individual upon the globe. Or perhaps a discussion of our opinions upon the barbarous commerce of enslaving an individual. So the floor is yours for the rest of our time here together. You've allowed it for us, and now it is yours. Any question you would delight to put forth is ours to reply. Or you may simply sit there and gawk. Yes?
What inspired you to establish the University of Virginia?
We have talked about it, have we not? Even when I was in Paris. We talked about that idea of a true university. This was something that inspired me when I was there, further inspired me when I happened to be there, by the coterie of physiocrats. Those gentlemen, Condorcet and Turgot, Pierre Samuel Dupont, of course, you nonetheless, I would cite accordingly, devoted to the pursuit of science and education, enlightenment as to how we might improve the condition of man, particularly in agriculture. But the idea of a university came to me when I was a young boy, having the privilege of an education simply because my parents had the means. And when you consider my father was only 49 when he passed away in 1757, leaving my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I, the eldest son, I hardly understood the weight of responsibility upon my shoulders. That was the weight of the British law of primogeniture, first genitor family. The eldest son in the family to inherit directly all of his father's freeholdings. My father, of course, in English terms, a freeholder, owned outright all of the property. The 5 farms, 3,500 acres, and as you well know, no different throughout our sister colonies, owned outright the majority of the families living upon that land. I hardly understood what this meant. I was only 14 years old. As I have written, how can a young boy, 14 years old, even begin to reason for what will befall him shortly? I understood it better when I was 21. And that was because my father, though deceased, left monies in his estate that I could continue my education. In fact, I've always said, the greatest legacy any parent may provide their children, particularly if called home too soon by their maker, is an education. That will return to them tenfold throughout their entire life. I had the good fortune to attend the Old Royal College of William and Mary and fall under the tutelage of one Dr. William Small, lamentably. Many do not remember him. I can never forget him. I have written of him, he had gentlemanly and correct manners. Is that not a foundation of the educated individual? Manners, respect. As students, we had great respect for him because he had great respect for us. His students, he realized each and every one of us was a new mind, never seen before, ready to be provoked in the intellect, inspired in the imagination. The recognition that our Creator has created our minds free, and free he desires it to remain. And secondly, he had an enlarged and liberal mind. Now, you know, I made that statement the other day, General. A gentleman wagged his finger at me and said, Mr. Jefferson, do not become political. I had no idea what he was referring to. I said, beg your pardon. He said, well, Mr. Jefferson, you mentioned the word liberal. I said, yes, sir, you heard correctly. I hope you have not forgotten. What is the definition of liberal? It comes from the Latin word libertas, and it means freedom. The freedom of the human mind. The greatest vehicle of freedom and happiness any individual possesses. You know that. Not a soul can take it away from you without your consent. And lastly, he had a happy talent for communication. He made learning lifelong, enjoyable. As I wrote as a young man, perhaps more than any other, he fixed my destinies. He helped me understand what a universal curriculum is, so different from a collegiate or parochial, limited curriculum. A university continues to grow as we discover new frontiers of knowledge on the horizon. So, sir, what is taking place now in Charlottesville, our university, begun on the 17th of October back in 1817, though called Central College at that time, our Commonwealth providing the name University of Virginia now. We hope the doors to open next year, 1825, and fulfill what I've been working on for more than 40, I would venture 50 years, nonetheless, when I was serving our nation in France.
Yes, monsieur.
Mr. Lafayette and President Jefferson, where were you when the Third Estate was locked out of the Estates General and the tennis court oath was taken? Were you present, or where were you, gentlemen?
Indeed, monsieur is referencing the tennis court oath that the president had spoken of earlier. To go back a bit further, the French Revolution, again, began on the 14th of July, 1789. And it really was brought on as a result of an economic crisis that was brought on as a result of France spending more money upon the revolution here in America than the Americans themselves. So they wanted to find a solution with that. So they called up the age-old legislative body called the Estate Générale. The Estate Générale is composed of the three classes of French society. The first estate being that of the clergy or the church, the second estate being that of the French aristocracy or nobility, of which I am a member of, and the third estate is everyone else. But the third estate made up 95% of the population, yet they only received one vote. So historically, typically the first and second estates would vote against the third estate, and the third estate would always come up wanting. So it was a rigid legislative body that had last been called up in 1614. The year was 1789. Would you call that an effective legislative body? I certainly would not. So as a result, when the Third Estate met in June of 1789, I was not present, for I was not a part of the Third Estate, but rather part of the Second Estate at that time. But there has been talk of you, Monsieur Jefferson. I know officially I do not think you were permitted to be present, but perhaps you could shed some light on that story, or perhaps on the epic painting that was made by Jacques-Louis David.
It was the middle of June, I believe. Well, could it have been about the 14th?
It was a bit later than that.
A little later. I had daily attended to business at Versailles. That was well known. And I had even attended the Estate General's meeting in this magnificent design. They called it the Menu Plaisirs, a menu of pleasures. It was an immense banqueting hall, and that's where the three estates would convene. And it was this particular day, a little later in June 1789, as they were proceeding to convene, that the doors were locked as the third estate arrived. And remember, you just heard the general, they were 90%, 95% of those estate generals, over 570 individuals, gentlemen, who found the door was locked. They were told that they were painting the inside of the Melupozias. They could not meet that day. Well, immediately, of course, they understood something was awry. And so they turned about and walked down the main thoroughfare in Versailles, Rue de Versailles. They walked down in search of another emporium that might accommodate them. And what did they find? They found a La Salle de Jean de Paume, a tennis court, about the size of this room. And so there they found the doors open, they went inside and convened themselves. In fact, they brought up a plinth from along the side, and the mayor of Paris, Monsieur Bally, stood up top and waved the Bill of Rights of the citizen that Marquis de Lafayette and I have been collaborating upon. And as David, the famous paper, Jacques-Louis David was wont to represent, they all leaned in to Monsieur Bally and took an oath representative of that ancient theme, the oath of Horace brothers. In ancient Rome, the three brothers who set about to avenge the death of their father. And so in that classical sense, this oath of the tennis court was painted. Now, was I there? I certainly would not have been in the midst of all of those individuals. It was not my duty nor my office to be there. I was minister plenipotentiary representing the cares of our nation. I could not intrude upon that. However, I will tell you that if you look at this remarkable rendering of that moment, truly in the history of man, that pulls together thousands of years, you will notice that there is a gallery right up top where the public could watch the game of what we now refer to at times as racquetball, that they could look in. And I will simply say, I will not disavow anyone who might have seen me standing there. I cannot say anything else. That would not be correct, either in my post, my commission at that time, nor would it be correct politically. But I would say that it would have been a remarkable opportunity to, having been involved in the beginnings of what became our American Revolution, to have been eyewitness to that particular occasion as well.
Other questions or curiosities? Yes, monsieur.
Earlier this evening, you touched on that somewhat famous frosty relationship you had with former President John Adams. Can you tell us all these years later, are you friendly with him? Are you in communication? Or perhaps you could summarize your disagreements.
Yes, he was here last year. Well, now I understand. I wouldn't want to speak over what he might have said at the time, but I can only assure you the general is planning to visit him and his family there, including Quincy Adams, I believe. And so he will hear firsthand what I have to say from my opinion. And that is, first and foremost, we were but victims of political schism. At that time, in the politics, which we were prey. We were preyed upon by the divisiveness of two political platforms that had grown, the Federalists, who were represented not by Adams, not by any means, represented by General Alexander Hamilton, who was also here not very long ago. And so in any respect, no, President Adams and I were preyed upon. The opposing platform were the anti-Federalist, which, yes, indeed, I certainly stood to represent. And it brought us into contention with one and the other, particularly inviting me to stand opposed to Adams for the office of the presidency. And so I can only tell you, in that election of '96, I lost. As was originally written in our Constitution, whoever receives the second highest number of votes, public vote in a presidential election, then becomes vice president. It's almost ludicrous to reflect upon. Nothing could be more ridiculous in our Constitution, but it was there. It was there. Remember, we talked about it. Had a few glasses of wine laughing over that one, and it was changed, thank heaven, with the 12th Amendment. But that would not occur to 1804. And so I had to be vice president to the gentleman that was victor of that election. I was not a silent vice president. I opposed our treatment of our former ally, the French, at that time. I opposed the banking bill. I opposed the government bill to assume the debt. I continued vehemently opposed to that. And then our nation became the more fractious. And so in the next election, 1800, who will ever forget that? There were 4 candidates standing for the office of president. Yes, some say 2 were vice presidential candidates. There was no such thing. 4 gentlemen contending to the highest office who had in themselves divided the political platforms. President Adams' platform, the Federalist, was divided by a Southern Federalist. Anyone remember? General Pinckney, you remember General Pinckney from South Carolina, yes. And my own platform, the Anti-Federalist platform, was divided by a former Federalist from New York. He actually came to visit me at Monticello. It was February of 1798. I knew what he was down there for. He was trying to read me out to see how I would stand in the next presidential election. Anyone know who I'm referring to? Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr. You're not going to visit with him, are you? I hope not. But in any respect, who will ever forget all 4 of these men and all contending with everyone else? That presidential election in 1800, all of the name-calling, all of the vitriol, all of the heresies amongst all of us, all of the twistification of the facts in the newspapers, all of the fake news printed in the tabloids, we'll never see anything like it again. It will never happen. Never. Do not worry about it. Come back here frequently. But the point to remember, and Mr. Adams, I know last year said, we can never forget this. We survived. Because common sense, American common sense, will always overwhelm political vitriol. Always. Always. And now I will tell you how we enjoy our correspondence. We refer to ourselves as but victims of politics. 2 others could have been standing in our shoes, fallen victim as well. And our correspondence I refer to as old man's milk. One of his letters is worth 2 from me. So thank you for that reflection. I can't wait till we find out what this means. Lady.
I thank you for inquiring as to my children. Well, tragically, my firstborn, that of Henriette, born in 75, would pass on in 77 when I was here in America for the first time. But my daughter, Anastasia, has grown to adulthood, has married, is prosperous in France itself, living outside the city of Paris. My son, of course, is with me on this expedition here to America. He served very gallantly as a soldier in the French army, as all of his ancestors had done, as his father had done. But when General Bonaparte performed a coup d'etat and became master of France, and he wanted me to serve him, since I did believe in the constitutional monarchy and not what Bonaparte had planned, my son did not elevate or rise or get promoted as quickly as he should have. But he served gallantly throughout the Napoleonic Wars, to include even taking part in that great campaign that went into Russia, into Moscow, and he is one of the few that was able to survive, and he retired from that moment. But he is with me, and we have had a delightful visit of many of the, or we are planning a delightful visit of many of the sites that I had experienced during the war. So I long for him to meet with Monsieur Jefferson, Monsieur Adams, Monsieur Madison, with the President, Monsieur Monroe, and who knows who shall win the next election, whether it be Jackson or whether it be John Quincy Adams. It would be nice for him to meet with both, and the battlefields that I had taken part in. So he has prospered and done well to include that. And my youngest, Virginie, who is formerly Marie-Antoinette Virginie, also has married and is prosperous, living in the Auvergne in the south, where our ancestral home is to be found by the Château de Chavagnac. So thank you, Madame, for inquiring as to my family. Other questions or curiosities?
Mr. Jefferson, I visited your home at Monticello recently, and I saw where you had a workup of your future burial monument. And I was curious, because there was something you left off of it.
Well, madam, I don't know whether I want to make it publicly known. At least as yet. How
You leave off President of the United States.
Oh, my heavens, of course I would leave that off. Yes, not out of any indignity, no, not anything like that at all, simply because in our nation it is temporary. It is temporary. It is an office ever to be filled through future generations by the approbation of the citizen body. So that we hope for many, many, many more to follow me in that regard. I served 40 years in public office, as I mentioned earlier, and each and every one of them was an honorarium in itself. And if those who care to read history discover in kind, well then, so be it. But I hope their observation will be as well that we are a nation of elective office and that no one is there, even in offices of appointment, unless it is ultimately by the will of the people. I care to be known by certain gifts that I have provided for mankind, not only for us as Americans, but worldwide. I would like to be known as the author of our Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Not one word more. By those three as testimonials I have lived. I wish most to be remembered.
Yes, madame.
There was
I admire and get starstruck in your presence. But you did develop the University of Virginia for our young men. But at the same time, your daughters were very well educated. So I guess this is more of, not a question, but an admiration that you did think that young women should be educated. I understand that Martha, your oldest,
Yes.
was one of the best educated persons, having been educated in France. Is this correct? So, because of the times, I guess, only young men were allowed to go to the university.
Well, and I would like the general to comment upon this as well, because the lady is quite correct. By recommendation, when I sailed to France and was accompanied by my eldest daughter, Martha Jefferson at the time, she was not yet married, to her cousin, Mr. Randolph, of course, Thomas Mann Randolph. We were accompanied by Mr. Hemings, James Hemings, as cook. It was recommended that she be enrolled, Martha be enrolled in the Abbey Royal de Pantamont. That was looked upon as the finest ladies' finishing school throughout all of the kingdoms of Europe. And so I was fortunate to be able to have the means to follow that recommendation. Now, you are correct, as I referred earlier to the British laws of primogeniture. If there were monies in the estate that could be provided for the family of a deceased father in particular, it would usually go to the eldest son. That the monies went to the privilege of an education for the male, not so much the female, with one exception. And that is if the family had enough means that they could hire a tutor to come live with the family and educate the young girls as they did the young boys. So remember, I was brought up with the privilege of an education solely in the hands of those who had the means. And you need but one or two moments of enlightenment through a good teacher to well understand it ought to be a birthright of every individual, and particularly in our nation. Because the General and I have discussed this many, many times. The only way that our nation will survive upon its founding principles and ideas, remember, our revolution was not to begin another monarchy, was not to begin another aristocracy, nobility. It was fought on behalf of the common man. And so therefore, the only way that will work for generations unborn is through an educated citizenry. Ignorance is not bliss. That's been known from time immemorial. And that nation which expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization expects what never was and never shall be. Do you know, I'm proud to say that Mrs. Randolph, my daughter referred to earlier, is devoted to education and has inspired in kind her daughters. And her daughters, Eleonora in particular and Cornelia, have become devoted to forming a ladies' finishing school at Edgehill Plantation in Charlottesville. I hope to live to see it, but I doubt I will. They tell me it will become amongst our nation's foremost ladies' finishing school. So you can see where this all began through their mother.
Absolutely. I am a firm believer that the greatest victories in life are not won upon any battlefield, but rather knowledge over ignorance. And I was blessed with an excellent education. In fact, growing up in the Auvergne, I was educated by a Jesuit priest named the Abbé Féon. So he taught me reading, writing, arithmetic, Latin, Greek, history, the same as all of you, no doubt. And from then, at 12 years old, I went to Paris. There I would attend the Collège du Plessis. And there, after the Collège du Plessis, I went to the Academy at Versailles. But I believe education will never stop, or should never stop. And we must constantly try to improve ourselves with knowledge of this grand world that we live in. Yes, it is true. There are many excellent schools for women in France, to be sure, but you are correct in that they are, for the most part, finishing schools. How they can be proper wives, mothers, and be entertainers as well. And that is predominantly what you are finding at many of these schools. But at the time of my writing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in August of 1789, there was a woman named Olympe de Gouges, and she wrote another document, and that was called the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Citizeness. And so she was echoing the sentiments that I had written in mine. So I think in France, there is a growing number of women who want to be treated the same as men. What do you think of that, madame?
I think we may have time for, now all the hands go up here. And, well, let's have time for just a few more questions. The lady there had her hand up for a while.
William and Mary is a very esteemed college, and we're very honored to be in your presence because you attended there, but also because you're one of our favorite presidents. But I wanted to know what type of advice you may have for aspiring students for William and Mary.
You know, there's another new university that's closer. You're familiar with the old Royal College of Women, right?
I bivouacked my division upon the campus of the College of William and Mary in September of 1781. We utilized the Wren building as a hospital, yes. But I don't think that's going to help for advice for those that are going to attend.
I can only suggest this, ma'am. You heard me refer to it earlier as what really spurred and promoted, inspired my vision for a true university. It is little known that when I became the second elected governor of the new Commonwealth of Virginia, took up residence in the old governor's palace, that I then initiated new schools to be created in the old Royal College so that it would rise to that level beyond collegiate to universal curriculum. I initiated a school of medicine, a school of modern languages, a school of literature, and I'm proud to say, the very first school of law in our nation. 1779, I commissioned George Wythe, under whom I had read law in Williamsburg, as the first master of law there. So I was pleased to have helped in that effort to lift it. Now, it did receive a great deal of controversy because it has been forgotten, but when I was growing up, William and Mary had been started as a seminary of the Church of England. And its first and foremost school, besides the grammar school for young boys whose family had the means, was the School of Divinity. And along with that, the Indian School, the purpose of which was to select the eldest sons in three particular tribes in the era, the Mattaponi, the Pamunkey, and the Chickahominy, to be Christianized under the Church of England. And so, therefore, a young boy would serve 7 years in the School of Divinity to receive his Arts Magister. I believe they're referred to now as masters. Still, he would have to sail across the ocean and be ordained in London in order to return and to take up a particular parish, or even to hire himself out as a teacher. So the point I'm leading to, when I became governor and realizing we severed our ties with the monarchy of England and severed our ties with the Church of England, then as governor, to institute the 4 schools I have mentioned earlier, I dissolved the School of Divinity. So that has continued over the years to have somewhat of a reaction to what I did there, and particularly in trying to begin our University of Virginia. There were many in the House of Delegates who stalled on that interest to create that university because of the experience that occurred in Williamsburg. But I have ever referred to it as my alma mater, and if you have someone who is interested in William and Mary, I encourage it, the more so because, this is little known as well, I know you know, General the Marquis, while I was there, they did not offer a baccalaureate. I was only there 2 years. Enrolled in the highest curriculum, the School of Mathematics and Natural Philosophy, yes. But a baccalaureate would not be offered until 10 years after I left in 1772. So in all honesty, I never received a degree. I never graduated from William and Mary. So I know that can be achieved by the young gentleman who is dressed so fashionably there to attend with great honors, I'm sure. We had 1 or 2 other questions.
Thank you for one thing, the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, he's thanking you, my friend.
No, you cannot thank me without thanking whom?
I wanted to thank both of you because I feel that, of course, you were part of that.
In reality, monsieur, I was not part of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. A bit of background on the great land acquisition by President Jefferson is that Louisiane, Nouvelle-Orléans, and all of that territory was once French, of course. But as a result of the difficulties during the 7 Years' War, this whole vast land had to be given up, and it was given to the Spanish with the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762. But when young General Bonaparte took the throne and became first consul, he decided to reacquire Louisiane. Because if you own Nouvelle-Orléans, you own the right of deposit. So anything that goes up and down the Mississippi River must pass through Nouvelle-Orléans, and thus you can collect monies upon it for the goods that are being transported back and forth. And what Bonaparte had wanted to do was to establish a Western empire here in North America. And its base of operations would be Nouvelle-Orléans. There was only one problem, and that was a big problem in Saint-Domingue, you call Haiti. And there was a slave revolt. Bonaparte attempted to put it down, but the yellow fever decimated his soldiers, and upwards of 30,000 of them lost, and thus the slave revolt would eventually be the second republic in the Western Hemisphere to be established. But Bonaparte knew that he was going to go back to war with England. So he knew he needed to get rid of Nouvelle-Orléans and all of Louisiane. And that's where Monsieur Jefferson came into play. You had dispatched Monsieur Livingston and now President Monroe there to do some negotiating with Bonaparte. And I believe Bonaparte had first offered you or requested $21 million. Did you accept that?
Well, I was not there because this was Mr. Livingston was minister plenipotentiary. I commissioned him to represent our interests there. We only had 5 representing our interests at kingdoms across the globe. So it was Livingston who realized we could not afford that. He counted, I think it was 12 billion.
And Bonaparte went up to 18.
And then Livingston came down to 15. Was
and
that
15 was agreed upon.
Yes, and I had instructed Livingston before he left. All we were interested in was New Orleans, as you said, because we had no idea that the French would allow us the opportunity to purchase over 830,000 square miles of the territory of Louisiana. So I said, do not suggest any more than $7 million for the purchase of New Orleans. We only had $17 million in our treasury at that time. In fact, we still do we not? So it was Livingston who actually bought it successfully for that remarkable doubling, some say tripling the size of our nation. Never let us forget this. remarkable example in the civility of mankind, accomplished by the stroke of a pen, not a sword. Remarkable. And so we have much to thank the French for that accomplishment. Citizens, I think we may have time for just one other question here. Wait, oh, yes, ma'am.
This is a medical slant. You mentioned smallpox immunizations. To what other maladies have you turned your attention?
Well, well, fever. We hardly understand where ague comes from. It's one of the reasons why I never get out of bed without soaking my feet in ice cold water. Yes, I learned that prescription when I was a young man in Williamsburg from Mr. George Wythe, under whom I read law. It is considered to prevent the common cold. I've gone 6 years at a time without a cold, so I can suggest that that is a method to prescribe yourself the maintenance of good health. Of course, Mr. Wythe, I don't know whether you remember, he would get out of bed in the morning, he'd go out of doors in the altogether, hoist up a pail of ice cold water from his well, and douse himself entirely in the altogether. So that unusual sound we'd hear in the morning in Williamsburg was not the rooster by any means. No, it was not.
It is very odd that Monsieur Franklin in Paris would often take these air baths without any clothes upon, just walking about entirely in the nude. Can you imagine? But he said it was good for his constitution.
He did, I recall that. One other thing, ma'am, and there's so many that I hope we can continue to move forth, ever on the verge, if you will, of further scientific investigation. We have never been able to understand why during the 10 short years that I was married, 10 years of uncheckered happiness to the late Mrs. Jefferson, why childbirth compromised her health. We could never understand why she craved sugar more than usual during childbirth, why our babies weighed heavier consecutively, to the extent our last child, our sixth child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed 12 pounds. Mrs. Jefferson did not survive. Not before I promised her I would never marry again. This is something that frequently occurs. We have no knowledge of why. And so therefore, I can cite that definitively as something else I have felt deep within my person and amongst our families with whom we have grown up and continue to live. This is something, General, I know we have talked about, that we might find ourselves as well equally unique as a new nation in the history of man, because we are the first amongst our founding principles to write in our system of government and laws this particular principle. It is Article 1, Paragraph 8, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 8. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 8. Congress shall promote the progress of science. It's right there. Right there. Our nation at the forefront in that effort. Well, citizens, if you will, yes, for the general.
No, it's a request,
Oh.
not a question. Yesterday, of course, was your birthday. I wanted to see if everyone would stand and sing happy birthday.
Well, now, sir, talking about science, here's something very relevant to it. Very relevant. You know what I'm going to say? The lady may know who's seen my tombstone. I was born April 2nd, 1743. But 9 years later, I began to celebrate my birthday on April the 13th. Now, I've heard it just softly uttered. What happened in 1752, now I'm only going to say this, for Great Britain and her holdings, her colonies. It had already happened 150 years before that. Do you hear? The calendar change. When I was born, England was still adamantly abiding by the Julian calendar created by Julius Caesar thousands of years ago. It included, as Caesar had calculated, as astronomers and mathematicians, a solar year at 354 days. The beginning of the year when? The vernal equinox, the middle of March. Makes sense, the resuscitation of life in the spring. Finally, and never let us forget this, who, for the benefit of modern man, transcribed the wisdom of the ancient world? The church. The church. And in the 16th century, Pope Gregory XIII realized, our mathematics has improved, our astronomy has improved. He ordered a recalculation of a solar year, particularly now that we know, through indeed the wisdom of Nicholas Copernicus, the eminent Pole, that it is the Earth that revolves around the sun. That had just occurred about a century earlier, if not during that century. He commissioned a new calendar. And that more perfectly calculated solar year made up with an extra 11 days. There was the extra time we could put into that solar year. And so 365 days, still not perfect. Science is never perfect. We're still striving for it. A quarter day each year we make up every 4 years. But then I think brilliant as well, and thanks to the church in many ways. The Pope moved the beginning of the year to those days of the least amount of light to purposely coincide with the presumed birth of Jesus of Nazareth, who brings to mankind further light as the days accrue more light through the year. Genius. All of the kingdoms of Europe accepted this. The kingdom of Portugal, Spain, France, of course, the Italies, the Germanys. England would have nothing to do with it. And listen, you know, to reflect upon this, we do not have to worry about this in our nation, do we? We do not have to worry about this. England stood staunchly Protestant until 1752. Seriously, she could no longer suffer remaining 11 days behind the business ledgers of Europe. That's what it is, to provide that greater standard of commerce throughout the world. So, sir, when everyone wants to acclaim my birthday, the 13th of April, well, I'm going to cut on my tombstone, born April 2nd, 1743, OS. Everyone knows what OS means here in the world. I know because in 1752, many Englishmen went back to their family Bibles, and next to the anniversaries of family births, marriages, and deaths, they wrote in OS. And if you were born in the first 3 months of the new year, you put a slash and you wrote in the new year. So I'm going to have cut on my tombstone OS and perplex the future. What is he talking about? It means simply old style, the old style calendar. So I thank you for that recognition of my birthday. But here, the general knows this. I have never, ever cared to have the anniversary of my birth recognized. The only anniversary, in my opinion, we should recognize is the birth of our nation. Absolutely. We have spoken upon that many times. General the Marquis de Lafayette.
President Jefferson.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good evening. Be sure to put your survey forms in the little box. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for coming.